How's it going, Bat family? Welcome to a brand new The Batman update video. Today we are going over all of that glorious information that we got out of the latest Empire issue covering the Batman, with all new details and interviews from director Matt Reeves, producer Dylan Clark, to the cast, of course, Robert Pattinson, Paul Dano, Zoe Kravitz, all of that good stuff. I'm not going to do the thing where I sit here and read out every freaking word from the magazine. At the end of the day, this is a purchasable magazine. I do recommend picking it up yourself. You can get a digital copy. Do not worry about getting it shipped to your own country. You can literally purchase this online and read the very word-for-word details yourself. But what I've gone ahead and done is bullet point all of the juiciest details that I want to go over and cover to you guys. So look at this as everything we've learned. You know, it kind of video breakdown of every literal cool piece of information that we got out of this Batman coverage, thanks to Empire. So without wasting too much more time, I would love for you guys to give a like on this video. I almost bloody forgot. Merry Christmas. I just want to say thank you to all the support on this channel. Long story short here, the past year so far has been my most successful year on YouTube so far, and that is probably a big part and thanks to you guys who watch, well, not only the Batman coverage, but whether you watch any of my videos. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone has happy holidays, stay safe, obviously with regards to COVID and stuff. I trust all of you are safe anyway with things like that. Without getting too cheesy, my Christmas present from any of you guys is just you watching my videos and liking them or whatever. Anything you do, from liking a video to commenting, you know, going out of your way to comment is another thing. Sometimes I don't even comment on videos that I watch, you know, so those who go even to put the effort to share their thoughts, send a nice word my way, it's always noted. I read every single comment, and just thank you for being here on the channel. I know this is kind of dragging out the video more, but I just wanted to make that crystal clear considering the date this is being uploaded. So thank you, and a Merry Christmas to you all. So I might be looking over here quite a lot considering the bullet points, but the first part of coverage that made me smile is Matt Reeves' Bat moment. There's no other way to interpret it, because Matt Reeves discusses this kind of initial part of the issue in where he has a fever dream when he was 3 or 4 years old, and how basically he had his own Bat moment in where he remembers seeing Batman on the ceiling and he wasn't afraid, and how, you know, something about this connected him to the character from there on out. I mean, obviously, as you may have heard him talk about before, he's been a big fan of Batman, whether it's from Adam West to whatever. But again, this somewhat made me smile, because it's like imagining a little Matt Reeves who's gone on to have what could arguably, hopefully, and it seems to be the definitive version of Batman so far, with just all the accuracies, the vision that we've seen from the trailers, and all the abundance of information he's already given us. A little version of him at 3 or 4, just like having a fever dream of a bat on his ceiling, but it, you know, he wasn't afraid of it. If anything, it just kind of was quite a pivotal moment for his connection to that character. Empire then goes on to somewhat discuss the recent history of Batman and its involvement in the media, from Snyder to even Keaton coming back in The Flash, and as we now know, Batgirl. By the way, check out my video yesterday covering how Keaton is reprising his role in Batgirl and what that basically means for the DCEU's Batman moving forward post-Flashpoint, considering J.K. Simmons is Jim Gordon is in there as well. I think that kind of spells who is Batman in the future, so check that out if you haven't already. I do think it will interest a lot of you. But anyway, to even the spin-offs with Bat stuff, such as Batwoman. So some people, as the magazine kind of rightfully points out here, wouldn't be blamed to think like, oh, have we reached like a bat saturation content at this point? So how can Matt Reeves bring something fresh onto the table? So this is when it gets discussed that, of course, there was some initial, oh shit, like how are we gonna do this moment when it came to agreeing to take this on in 2017. Dylan Clark, the producer, discusses with Empire, going on to say that it didn't really stop their ambition though, understandably, with him even saying, and I really like, I've heard this before this even came out, because as you know, there was quite a few Empire previews uploading portions of this issue online to kind of tease you to understandably want to buy this magazine. And Dylan Clark, the producer, said to Christopher Nolan directly that they're trying to be the best Batman ever made, and that they're going to try and beat him. Which, you know, understandably, I can imagine some comments saying, like, oh, how that might come across, but that's just like, you know, that they're friendly with each other, and if anything, that's how hard they're, you know, working to try and make this movie to leave their mark, because obviously it goes without saying that the Nolan trilogy, whether you don't agree that all of them are as equally as good as the other one, whether Dark Knight's at the top, whether you view Batman Begins as the best one, they were pivotal Batman movies. When zooming out and looking at the scope from, you know, the inception of Batman to where we are at now in modern times in cinema. So to try and strive to beat something as hugely popular as the Dark Knight trilogy with what Christopher Nolan did there, you know, I kind of respect Dylan Clark for having that attitude and even saying that to Nolan. And he was probably like, we'll see. As far as Matt Reeves as a filmmaker, this is where all of this discussion kind of goes back to his little Bat moment, fever dream, in terms of when he was like 4 years old, and which is just really meant to speak larger to the mythic power of the character and how that can be brought about in the film with his approach. He also discusses how a movie for, you know, Matt Reeves, it just has to come from this personal place, otherwise he gets lost. And that's one thing I really respect about Matt Reeves as a filmmaker. He doesn't just, you know, and I don't blame anyone who does make films for the sake of a film or just getting that license to do whatever. For Reeves, it's like he has the luxury of being able to pick and choose. And his attitude with Warner Brothers back in 2017 as well, which we're about to get onto, it's like, I'm going to do it my way. If you know, it's your characters, your license, your IP and stuff, and that's your prerogative. So if you want to turn me down, that's all cool. But if we're going to do it, and I'm going to do it, we're going to do it my way. Now, that's a part of some other different kind of podcasty interview, but it all reminds me of that discussion. And as we know, this is a very personal story for not only, you know, what Matt Reeves wants to put into it, but for Bruce Wayne and the psychological development in this first film, let alone when we get to that psychological development with comments from Robert Pattinson saying how he's already got a psychological roadmap for Bruce for the next 2 movies. These pages around about this time in the coverage are accompanied by those already publicly released Empire promotional photos for the movie, whether that's the one with Batman in the rain, whilst he's looking probably at the train gang, as we've already been over in previous videos, to the one of Bruce out of the suit in the kind of Kurt Cobain mode, if you will. Now, the greatest thing from this segment of the initial coverage in the issue is just hearing Matt Reeves talk about why this movie takes a deep dive for him. We've heard, obviously, how locked on his sights are for the movie anyway over the years, from whether that's his comments at DC Fandom a couple years back, to all kinds of, you know, information that he's put out. But he states that he has to work from the inside out, and how Batman is one of the few comic book characters that has that opportunity for him. Another detail of the Batman that Empire covered, which I'm really appreciative of, is kind of the backstory of how all of this came to be, because we can't really forget that it wasn't really ever Robert Pattinson. The Batman was kind of the working title for Ben Affleck's Batman movie, and this is what we're moving on to now, with how that was involving an Arkham Asylum breakout aspect with Deathstroke, and naturally it details how after that there was a bit of a transition. One of the biggest takeaways kind of being what I've already briefly mentioned, with how it's emphasizing some of what we already knew, of which I was saying back in the early days. If you go back to some of my early coverage with how I was saying the Batman movie is no longer having Ben Affleck in it, or should I say Robert Pattinson isn't a younger Batfleck, you had a lot of stands of the Batfleck just going, no, 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 you don't know that, you don't know that, I don't forget you guys, I do not forget, do not doubt me. But jokes aside, Reeves emphasized to Warner Brothers that he would need to create an iteration of Batman with a personal aspect to it, which was not connected with all of the other parts of the DCEU. After all of this, Affleck quitting, new leadership at DC, you could say that green light was bursting through the door, now being open for this, and Reeves just kind of walked right on through. The producer Dylan Clark goes on to speak about this larger multiverse, or the DCEU, which, as we know, like, that's just a thing now. We've got the DCEU, we've got some kind of Elseworlds projects going on with Joker, that's already been and gone, but who knows, we could get a Lex Luthor solo movie in the future. That's just an example. But then we've got like another pocket universe over here with Reeves' Batman. So he says that Warner Brothers has this kind of multiverse where they're just generally exploring different ways to use the character, and that they don't really want to get involved with that. And I do not blame you. I'm kind of happy about this. Not that I'm not a fan of the DCEU, but I'm glad that the you know, the little Reeves verse over here with Pattinson has his own little kind of snow globe. With regards to Matt Reeves and just his take, as we all know, he's just interested in pushing Batman towards the emotional depths and just shaking him to his core. And as reiterated by Pattinson in this recent coverage, you know, that psychological map, as I've already mentioned in this video or other videos, is already being roadmapped out in his own head for the next 2 possible movies. So you can see how each movie, no matter what, especially as we're starting in year 2 Batman, it's all about this psychological development. And that's what Reeves, even though that's what we're getting heavily into in the first movie, it's not exactly like the second movie and the third movie is going to be a rehash, but you can always ground Bruce Wayne in psychology, and that is something that won't go amiss or feel the same when they do that again in the second and third movie. It will just be done in new, innovative ways to kind of build and build and build upon the Batman's character, and obviously developing him, because where we're at in year 2, 1 year 6 months in the first movie, as Reeves says, this is a Bruce and Batman who doesn't exactly know how to go about being Batman. He's kind of just doing. He hasn't got that expertise yet. Reeves does insist, you may have heard this one before, that this isn't an origin story. This has been stressed since the first time we've heard about this movie. It isn't, and this is a quote, it is not Batman Begins again. That's to all the people who keep saying, oh, it's just another Batman Begins. No. He wants you to connect to him, not only as Bruce, but as Batman. He doesn't know exactly how to be Batman. It's a year 2 story. Now, as far as Zoe Kravitz and the coverage they did for her with some interviews, we got some nice insight here with how she speaks of getting into Catwoman's headspace in just a variety of ways, as you would hope that she would. With Reeves, one comic in particular, and I found this super interesting because there is, you know, when you get into us fans learning about this is where you can pick up this comic and just really rinse and repeat read it to get in the same headspace maybe Zoe Kravitz did, albeit that I trust a lot of you have already read this comic. And she goes on to say that with Reeves, one comic in particular that was honed in on was Frank Miller's Batman Year 1. So for Zoe, she just really focused on that. Now, she talks about, obviously, there is a variety of iterations and variations of Selina Kyle and Catwoman out there, but she took all of the info she needs for her role in the Batman version of Catwoman in year 1, or should I say just as the year 1 version. She took that, as she says so herself, as the script. And the reason for that is, before anyone's like, why didn't she look at like, you know, all of the other versions and kind of, you know, blend them into one so she was educated as much as she could? I agree with the approach she had here, because she didn't want to clutter her mind, as she puts it, with all of the other takes of Selina, so it didn't get in the way of what Matt did as what she describes as a beautiful job with this movie / script. Like, especially as he details, like, the main thing is Batman Year 1 Selina. Why would she kind of go out there and just be like, okay, this Selina, New 52 Selina, that Selina, all this Selina? You know, I really understand what she was going for there. It's also detailed later that Matt Reeves not only looked at Frank Miller's Batman Year 1 described dominatrix version of Catwoman, but also Alan J. Pakula's 1971 neo-noir Clute and Roman Polanski's Chinatown. Reeves saw her being mixed between Brie Daniels, the cool girl played by Jane Fonda in Clute, and Evelyn Mulwray, who's Faye Dunaway in Chinatown. Another detail I really appreciated, and this isn't, you know, I kind of half expected it, but you don't know for sure until you hear it. Like, you never properly know, but she details that there's a great moment where you will see that Selina has all of these, you know, tons of cats. And when the interviewer asks about Zoe having brought quite a few of her own ideas to the character to Matt when she came on board, like Selina's compulsion to take in strays, Kravitz then went on to somewhat say she wanted to get into the psychology of that. Why does Selina Kyle have all of these cats? And when you see the movie, it becomes apparent in how it's all connected to who she is as a human. As far as the rough details we got from her with regards to plot, it's really regurgitated just from what the DC Fandom China interviews were about, where she says that you meet Selina working at a club that's connected to the underground mob world of Gotham City, and with these murders going on, Batman's detective work leads him to Selina, who's looking for a friend of hers who has gone missing. Both Batman and Selina need each other, but you're not really sure if they're working together or using each other. Again, kind of word for word what we've heard before from the interviews at DC Fandom, which I do recommend checking out that video on my channel if you missed those hidden panels. I call them hidden because they weren't a part of the main DC fandom event. But if you're wondering what underground club that's connected to the mob is, I do think that this is basically the Iceberg Lounge, or a kind of proto version, early version of the Iceberg Lounge. One of the promo photos as well, we see Oz Cobblepot sat down, as I kind of mentioned, in another photo, but one of the lampshades has kind of a bit of an umbrella around it. So yeah, before it's like the prim proper 6 to 8, 10 years down the line from the events of this movie in time, I think that will lead to, you know, a club where it's a bit more prestigious and more theatrical rather than maybe a club, not that I'm saying that this is in the Narrows or something, but in a bit more of a maybe grotty area of Gotham, whereas one day that Iceberg Lounge will be, as I said, kind of quite high market. I've already spoke about this in one of my previous videos when I was talking about the Empire coverage that they were already teasing that was going to be a part of this issue, but without retreading too much from that previous video, she details the stunt work and how with Pattinson, you kind of feel the characters and where they are emotionally behind how he might, you know, throw a punch. And that makes sense. Like, he's kind of very impulsive and quick to rage in the movie. So with that somewhat comparison and analogy, with Selina, they watched Cats and Lions and how they fight, and how this turned into Selina's skill being fast and tricky, since obviously she's not as strong as Batman. At the end of the day, you kind of think to yourself, well, how do you go about, you know, facing up against that? Well, it's the kind of speed part of it. Now, somewhat memes aside and jokes aside, because some people were quoting that, like a lot of haters of the movie, just like showing Kravitz's comments, like studying cats in the wild kind of thing. It's like obviously not as face value as that. And if anything, I kind of really feel like it's been shown what exactly they're doing there. For you can literally see this in the trailers with, as in the Empire magazine coverage, and where Zoe Kravitz says with the feline dance-like movement, you can literally see that in this shot you're seeing on screen with the kind of slow kind of stance that she has. That's kind of what she's going on about, and I trust that we'll see even more in the actual choreography of her stunt work. I think it's important to note as well that she did say that it was one of the hardest jobs she's ever done, but there was never a moment where she wondered, was any of it worth it? Now, as far as Pattinson, we've got a few details, some of what we've known before, such as initially he says that donning the Val Kilmer Batman Forever suit was absolutely terrifying. They were kind of like, you know, the people who look after the old suits, if you break this is kind of on you. And obviously at this time he didn't properly know if he had landed the role yet, but Reeves knew that, and I love hearing about this, even though we've heard about it a few times before, that he wanted Pattinson for the Batman after seeing him in Good Time. And if you haven't seen Good Time, do yourselves a favor. This is where he talks about what we've already been over, with how you can see the somewhat vulnerability and desperation in that movie, but also his power, and how this was a great mix, but also how he's got that Kurt Cobain thing in where he looks like a rock star, but you feel like he could be a recluse. Now, this is where we do learn something pretty big, and as I kind of said, something I kind of low-key knew about for months, but, you know, luckily it came up in videos when it came to the discussion series for people wondering about what if he lives in the city and how he can get around faster. I was like, oh yes, what if he did wander around, live in the city? And, you know, that was kind of easier for access for how he got around. And where we see Bruce in the Batman and where it picks up, he is in a hermit mode. Another thing we've spoken about on the channel for quite some time. But he lives in Gotham's Wayne Tower. Wayne Manor is indeed still about, but it's now an orphanage. Now, I really love that idea. Like, Wayne Manor is still about, it's out there. I believe we've already seen it. You know, there's some, I believe on the Blu-ray footage or whatever of the Batman Year One commemorative edition, when we see Gordon, or even it might be the B-roll footage that they played before the main trailer at the recent DC Fandom, we see Bruce and Batman and Gordon burst through the doors, and it says G.O. there. Now, these may be the front doors to Wayne Manor, since Gotham Orphanage, I believe, is Wayne Manor, and it's kind of, you know, it ties it even more personally to everything we've got into with how Ed may have lived in Wayne Manor. You know, that photo in the trailers where we saw Thomas Martha Wayne, a younger Bruce, Edward Nashton with the choir kids, orphans, if you will, singing, but looking over at the Waynes. That could have been done in Wayne Manor and was a publicity shot, because they, the Waynes, donated the Wayne Manor to be a place as a Gotham orphanage. Another way of looking at it, if it wasn't done then, maybe after the Waynes died, Bruce donated Wayne Manor as a new orphanage. That's another possibility. I don't know the intricate details behind that, but one thing I did always know, and to be honest, this might have been flowing out there for a while anyway. Obviously, it was getting out somehow if I found out about it months ago, that Bruce Wayne was indeed living like in a kind of penthouse situation in Wayne Tower. The interior of it is still very gothic Wayne Manor looking, which is probably what you see in the trailer, and I've always taken to be when he's spray painting his visual investigation on the floor. That was one of the rooms in Wayne Tower, if you will. I think that's the way we need to take that. And lastly, my comments on this is just that I'm absolutely fine with this. You know, this is year 2. This doesn't mean that for some reason or another he doesn't eventually go back to Wayne Manor. Maybe because of some events it kind of makes him want to expand the Batcave under Wayne Manor. Maybe if the Lego thing is true, for all I freaking know, with how the Riddler battle is in the Batcave, which I really am not saying it is. I really do want to stress that. I'm just saying maybe Wayne Terminus is a temporary place of operations for a young Batman until things, you know, there's so much room for growth to be a bigger Batcave in the future, as well as a bigger everything in the future, if you know what I mean. And some people kind of feel a bit alienated, like, hey, what, Reeves? How dare you make the place where Bruce lives in Wayne Tower? No, to me, I actually really dig this. Like, this is the most accurate Batman we've had in a while, but I'm all about innovation. With adaptations comes innovation. And this isn't mega innovative, because it's not like it hasn't been done before. But I'm down with a younger Bruce always looking over Gotham City. Like the guy in the B-roll footage, as you're seeing in this photo, is looking out the windows of whatever, probably up Wayne Tower, looking out at Gotham. He's always there. He's in the heart of Gotham. To me, that actually makes more sense than living in Wayne Manor all the way out on the outskirts of the city type thing, if you know what I mean. This I actually love. Not that I'm opposed to him going back to Wayne Manor or whatever happens in the second or third movie, but you get my meaning with this, and the more you think about it, the more it makes sense for the ease of access for Batman, the fact that he can kind of disappear into Wayne Tower. The only things that I might have I really hope they do well, so I don't have as much of an issue with, is that when he's driving the Batmobile and wherever, how he gets that stored, that it doesn't seem obvious that, oh, like the, you know, because Batwoman does this, or has done this in the past on that TV show. Batwoman goes kind of back into the Chicago Wayne Tower building, if you know what I mean. It's just like, man, like, you couldn't make that look any less obvious, or like just kind of like go somewhere else that connects to an under tunnel type thing. Now the next details, once again, we've kind of covered in the recent Empire previews of this very issue, where he details in how he's not a socialite at all. There is no Lucius Fox dispensing pre-made gadgets. He's self-constructed. He's building all of these little contraptions and things just with Alfred. And even Alfred thinks that he's gone insane. Pattinson then details how Bruce made the Batmobile himself, so there's this kind of tangibility to it. One thing I really appreciate is how they got a little comment out of Pattinson in the issue saying how, you know, when he was able to get his own hands on it after stunt driving training for weeks, after they wanted him to drive at only 10 feet, he immediately went off for 25 minutes trying to do all the stunts and little tricks that he learned in the stunt drive training. And once that he had done that, he wasn't allowed to drive it again without somebody else in the car. But wouldn't you do the same thing? As for the larger comments on the Batmobile from Reeves and whatnot, I love these descriptions. It is so good. And he says it's not only kind of meant to look cool, but kind of scary too. It's intended to make an appearance out of the shadows to intimidate. So Reeves thought of it almost like Stephen King's possessed motor, Christine. Reeves likes the idea of the car itself as a horror figure, making this animalistic appearance to really scare the hell out of people that Batman's pursuing. There is absolutely a horror genre aspect to this movie. Now, that's not to be confused with, this is a horror Batman movie, but it has horror aspects to it. And to kind of speak onto the age rating, even Pattinson says that when seeing a cut of the movie a few weeks earlier, that he thought that this is a really disturbing and scary movie. One of his first questions was, after seeing the movie, just like, wait, what? This is PG? How is this going to work? You know, he says it feels very visceral. Like, it's not pulling any punches. So they are pushing the mark of PG-13. And considering a lot of fans were concerned about that, wanting this Batman movie to be R-rated, well, if you like the BVS warehouse scene and that kind of gave you a bit of Batman edge that you like, well, then imagine that in the Batman type. But then hearing comments from Pattinson saying, how is this even PG-13? Like, they are going beyond what PG-13 can even really do, and they're kind of getting away with it. Now, as far as Alfred, good old Alfred Pennyworth, he is indeed still the family butler, as we all know, but is also a bodyguard in this iteration, which, you know, makes sense. You know, in this version, as I've always described to you in this vision, he is younger. Like, he's kind of more of what I liken to a Sean Pertwee Alfred in Gotham, Fox's Gotham. We got to see how that Alfred was still Alfred, very prim, proper, but ex kind of SASE military trained, but was hands-on with Bruce at that young age. Now, obviously, Alfred isn't exactly a young man in this movie, but he's more muscular. He does act as a Bruce Wayne bodyguard, and I wouldn't expect to see him go ham or anything, but you get the idea. Like, he is family butler, but also kind of literally listed as bodyguard as well. But it kind of goes a lot deeper than that with the relationship between Bruce and Alfred at this point in time, of which really lines up to what I was envisioning anyway with everything we've already heard. So what we learn here as well with Alfred is that he's not as supportive as he is in the other iterations, which again makes complete sense with the infancy of Batman's career here. Andy Serkis says that Bruce is on this somewhat nihilistic journey, and Bruce and Alfred have pulled apart, got to the point of where they almost no longer talk, and if they do actually end up bumping into each other, it's this very icy and painful greeting. It's described as they almost live in separate worlds now. Now, I kind of completely am on board with this, even though Alfred's been helping him with these contraptions and whatnot. It's still something that is like you see in the trailer. If you carry along this path, this terrible abbreviation, you know, you're gonna have nothing left, all right? So that comment was made out of concern for Bruce when he's going this far in a Riddler case. But in of itself, it's not this massively approved of thing that he's watching his, you know, this man or this kid that he looked after, and after his parents died, grow into a man, and now he's doing all of this, putting himself in harm's way. It's kind of actually only natural for Alfred to be a bit disapproving of this, and it's led to some probably cold debates that have pushed them a bit further away from each other to the point of what I just read out. They kind of live in separate worlds now through probably prior moments. Also just Bruce's locked on attitude. He might not have that headspace to go through it with Alfred again. Thus, every time they kind of do happen to bump into each other, it might be this kind of icy greeting. But I do guarantee at some point it's going to start here, but then it's going to get to a point of where they only come closer together more than ever. With, you know, just their relationship through not only Bruce growing, because, you know, that's a big part of this first movie. He doesn't know quite how to be Batman. He's still trying to figure it out. It's this criminological experiment that he hasn't quite nailed. That is very frustrating to him. But through the course of this movie, he will grow, become a bit more wise. He will kind of think a bit more outside the box as how to kind of handle all of this. And as he does that, there will be more room for letting other people in. And also Alfred coming around on this maybe a bit more as well, to where it will be more that Batman year 3, year 4, year 5, where it's like they are very much so hand in hand. Let's do this. I'm looking after you, Master Wayne. Even though that's still the case, it's probably coming from more of a place right now where he's thinking like, this kid I've, you know, raised is doing this. Like, he's probably stressing that you need to try and attend these board meetings at Wayne Enterprises. Bruce is just kind of like this. Sorry, Alfred, like, I'm not interested. There's a whole lot of complexity and nuance there that I you know, kind of speaks for itself, and I don't really need to get into. But I can't wait to see. This is one of my most anticipated things. It's not just a relationship between Jeffrey Wright, Jim Gordon, and Bruce, but like Alfred, and what that's like at this point in his career. And I don't think anyone can be alienated about hearing the fact that they're not mega close at this part, considering the context lines up perfectly, really, to where things really kind of are at this point in time. Now, when discussing another important aspect and focus of this movie, which is, of course, another fundamental part of Batman's character that hasn't always been capitalized on before, is the world's greatest detective part. Now, Pattinson explains that he thought that the world's greatest detective part would be more of a vibe, if anything else, but it turned out to be something more. He thought initially it would just be more of a mood board of how Reeves wanted to make the movie look, but it is indeed a detective story, and how that impacts the movie makes it fascinating and very different from other superhero movies. As for everything you've already heard, even just before this or in this video, Matt Reeves, for every character in the Batman, wanted or just went after a real world analogy to ground it. And you can liken that to his comparison for Bruce Wayne and the kind of Kurt Cobain vibe of all of that, the grunge that is kind of inserted into this movie. But for the Riddler, Reeves said, as we all know, he made him think of the Zodiac Killer, the serial killer who was never apprehended, who terrorized in Northern California in the late 60s. Reeves goes on to detail, obviously, Zodiac Killer went around in a black, crudely made costume with an insignia and an executioner-type hood, and in the darkest of dark ways, he's somewhat this real-world analogy for one of these rogues gallery characters. And Reeves basically praises Paul Dano in this issue for saying that he's a chameleon and the ideal actor to pinpoint the intersection between understanding who the Riddler is while making him larger than life, and that he always imagined Paul Dano in the role as he was writing. Paul Dano was very excited by this interpretation of the Riddler by saying that he was surprised by it and frankly thought that it was better than it had any right to be. And he goes on to detail that Matt, as well as making contact with the universe and this archetype, the world, the fans, that he's delivering something that comes from a very real place of gut and heart and psychology. He then details that until he read the script, he was quite cautious, but within a few pages into the script, he knew he was in really good hands. Reeves really opened the door for him in where the interpretation of the character hasn't really been seen before, which is scary, but mostly exciting because it gives them the chance to really go somewhere. When being asked where that exactly takes him and where he goes with the Riddler, he says, you know, just kind of like the Riddler with the puzzles and things like that. He doesn't want to divulge too much. But he does say that one thing that first struck him when first talking to Reeves was how we can interpret trauma in different ways. Further explaining that some can use that fire for good and some can use it for something else. And once again, this is something that we've got into on the channel with our discussion series on kind of this long road to the Batman. And I do recommend checking those videos out because it's kind of just getting into the nerdy stuff week to week to week and discussing what we're looking forward to the movie. And one of those things that we've got into a few times with you guys back and forth is how trauma has not only affected Bruce Wayne and how he's asserted, fighting crime in Gotham, but not in the way that the Riddler has. And the Riddler's kind of combating it, this corruption and what's personally impacted him with his own trauma through, well, doing what he's doing in this movie. And you can say that Selina's got trauma, even Penguin's got trauma, and where that led those two characters as well. And again, I just love how all of this is so psychologically grounded that way and how it makes sense to bringing these comic book characters to life. Despite the Zodiac Killer being one of the inspirations for the Riddler, Paul Dano said it was, certainly, however, that wasn't the Bible for him. He mentions how he liked how both grounded and big this film is at the same time, so the grounded forces were the Zodiac Killer, but it's still the Batman, so it's much bigger. He felt it was important to let his imagination react to the script rather than strictly basing it on, just a serial killer. As for Oswald Cobblepot, well, there is no top hat, and something we were discussing in recent videos as well, with regards to his umbrella. We note that he has had an umbrella in the trailers and stuff, but we were wondering, I wouldn't be surprised maybe if there was a weapon or kind of like a little latch that, lets out a spike at the end. Well, Colin Farrell does detail that there is one scene where he has an umbrella in his hand, but it doesn't have a trigger on the handle. However, he still has a limping gait, so there is a waddle. However, Oz is not fully inhabiting this somewhat mythology of the Penguin, because we're not quite several years in yet, and as a result of that, not inhabiting mythology of the Penguin from the comics, he doesn't take too kindly to the name. He's working his way up in the ranks and hasn't become a kingpin yet. Yet again, I do feel like we're going to see examples where he loses his shit after somebody calling him Penguin, or maybe he's one of his goons saying or laughing about it, and maybe he shoots one of them, who knows. But I do feel like something will happen where he just chooses to embrace that name, turn one of his slight weaknesses at just how slighted he is at hearing that name into a strength, and he'll turn that name Penguin into the title of his Kingpin mode when he achieves said Kingpin mode in the future. Reeves does note that his inspiration for Oswald in this movie is a lot from 70s cinema, like a touch of John Cazale's Fredo from The Godfather, and a dash of Bob Hoskins from The Long Good Friday, and even some Tony Soprano. Now, Reeves also details that Penguin is a mid-level mobster, and he's got a little bit of showmanship to him. But you can see that he wants more, and that he's been underestimated. He's ready to make his move. Now, that really intrigues me. He's been underestimated. By who? Other mobsters, surely. Who are other mobsters? Falcone. Now, I'm not saying, because a lot of people have commented, really another Falcone to just die in the first movie with John Turturro's Carmine, which we haven't seen too much of, by the way, but we know he's playing a fairly significant role. It does make me wonder if he's been underestimated and he's ready to make his move. That means he's ready to make his move against other big mobsters. And we know that Maroni, due to those newspaper clippings, has already been busted or something from that first DC Fandom trailer. So the arguably biggest mobster left is Falcone, who we've seen share scenes with the Penguin on the steps of the cathedral, for example. So I wonder if he's ready to make his move against Carmine, and if something like that happens towards the end of this movie, which leads a power vacuum and thus one for him to fill and become, or take a larger step towards the Penguin's kingpin status in Gotham City in the future. I really like Colin Farrell's comments on, how he compares, or, even how Reeves took the inspirations about Fredo's influence to Penguin, and he discussed how Fredo was just crippled by the insignificance that he lives within in a family that is full of very strong, very bright, very capable, and very violent men, which is why he commits that act of betrayal that he does, because he's weak. He's kind of broken and he's in pain. There is a kind of fracture at the core of Oz, which fueled his desire and ambition to rise within this criminal cabal, if you will. And that's something I really love. I feel like Fox's Gotham, whether you love it or hate it or whatever, they did quite a good job at showing the fracture within the Penguin there, and how that just really made him compensate for that wound he was suffering with in the similar ways that Colin Farrell just described, and it elevated him to seek that power out and prove everybody wrong. And as a result, people underestimate him, and it's similar strokes of paint with the Batman's Oz as well. And where that rise of power goes, well, he says that he would love to get to explore that in the second film. And a big day for him was when Mike Marino and his team of wonderful artists first put on the suit. He walked around the studio, and then the voice work, the dialect started coming out, and Oz just came alive. And he said it was extraordinary. And yeah, I can imagine it was, because as he even goes on to say, as far as if it's restricting, it was actually the complete opposite. As he would gesture, it moved beautifully. It obviously had some weight to it and some kind of understandable things. You might sweat a bit under it, but that wasn't obviously that debilitating considering the heavy prosthetics that he was under. And he details that because of this, it was an absolute liberation from self. He says that he has never been so far from being able to claim full ownership of a character than I am on this one. Now, as for Jeffrey Wright, not so much coverage here about him, interestingly, but as for Gordon, he's still a lieutenant, so it gives Jim the opportunity to be more hands-on and find himself in the muck. I completely agree, because at the end of the day, police commissioner removes you from certain duties that, you might be able to do as a detective or a lower ranking person within, the GCPD. So it makes me wonder, with Pete Savage likely biting the dust in this movie, he's the current commissioner, does that really mean that Jeffrey Wright's Lieutenant James Gordon will be taking that role? Maybe. And at the end of the day, they can probably change it a little bit with, even though he's the commissioner, doesn't stop him from really seeking out Batman's help and liaising with him just in the ways we are here. But I do think it's accurate to say that through him being a lieutenant, it means he can actually be in that muck with Batman on the front lines. And Reeves saw this somewhat equivalence in the way between Gordon and Batman, and the journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and how they interact with Deep Throat, their insider informant in All the President's Men. And they have a lot of scenes, as Jeffrey Wright says, from that of Deep Throat, between the two of them, and together they're just trying to work out what's going on. It's all very noir and complex, and Reeves' Gotham inhabitants, it seems, have very real-world concerns. So that is mainly all of the information. I may have left out one or two tidbits. I wanted to kind of abbreviate and just expand some of my own thoughts and just spit out everything as fresh as it can be. as we pave our way further and further towards the Batman's release in March. It looks like we, still have got maybe yet another couple of teasers to go. Not massive, utter trailers, so to speak, but anything coming out, you can be sure to know that it will be covered on this channel. But hey, as a Christmas present to me, like this video, I'd really appreciate that. If you want to follow me further outside of this, I do have links to my Twitter in the top pinned comment. It's not in the description of the video, it's in the top pinned comment, which is my comment. So I just want to say again, Merry Christmas to everyone. I hope you have a lovely few days ahead. I have no idea when I'm uploading next, but it won't be like a massive amount of time, but understandably, this is probably the last video for a few days. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your Christmas Eve. And I guess just a Merry Christmas to the best Bat family out there. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.